Jackson, Mississippi, WJDX radio station. April 1951. Station manager Walter Garrett stood in his office holding two records. Both were Nat King Cole recordings. Both had been sent by Capitol Records for airplay consideration. The first, Route 66 by the King Cole Trio, instrumental jazz, piano, bass, guitar, no vocals. The second, Mona Lisa, Nat's voice, smooth, intimate, singing directly into the listener's ear. Garrett placed Route 66 in the approved pile. Mona Lisa went into the rejected pile. His program director, Tom Sullivan, watched. "Sir, Mona Lisa is #1 on the national charts. Our listeners are requesting it." "I'm aware of what's on the charts," Garrett replied, "but we're not playing it. The trio's instrumentals are fine, but his solo vocals, they're not appropriate for our audience." "Why not?" Garrett paused. He couldn't say what he really meant, so he used code. "His voice is too intimate, too smooth. It's not suitable for white female listeners. It crosses boundaries that shouldn't be crossed." Sullivan understood immediately. This wasn't about music. It was about race and sex and fear. A black man's voice singing love songs coming through the radio into white homes, into white women's ears. That was threatening. That was dangerous. That had to be controlled, so WJDX would play Nat King Cole's piano, but not his voice. Before we dive into how white-toned radio stations across the Deep South banned Nat King Cole's vocal recordings while playing his instrumental jazz, how station managers used coded language like "too intimate" to mask racial and sexual anxieties about black masculinity, and how the same stations would play white singers covering Nat's exact songs while banning his original versions. Let me ask, where are you watching from? Drop a comment, because this story about controlling black voices is as relevant in 2026 as it was in 1951. The policy wasn't written down. There was no official memo saying ban Negro vocals but allow instrumentals. It was understood, implicit, enforced through station manager decisions that never had to be defended publicly. Across the Deep South, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, Louisiana, white-toned stations developed remarkably similar policies in the early 1950s. They would play King Cole Trio recordings. The instrumental jazz was considered safe. Background music, no words, no intimacy, just sophisticated jazz that white listeners could appreciate without feeling threatened. But Nat's solo vocal recordings, banned or severely restricted. The stated reasons varied by station, but the underlying logic was consistent. His voice was too intimate, too personal, too smooth, inappropriate for family listening, not suitable for our demographic. What they meant but couldn't say publicly: a black man singing romantic songs to an undifferentiated radio audience that included white women was crossing racial boundaries that Southern culture demanded be enforced. The mechanism of threat was parasocial intimacy. When Nat sang "Unforgettable, That's What You Are, Unforgettable, Though Near or Far," he was singing to the listener, directly, personally. His voice created the illusion of one-on-one connection. For white Southern stations, that intimacy was acceptable when the singer was white, but when the singer was black and the potential listener was white and female, it became threatening. Radio was intimate technology. It entered homes, it spoke directly into individual ears, it created private experiences in domestic spaces. Nat King Cole's voice, warm, smooth, emotionally expressive, was particularly good at creating that intimacy. That's what made him successful nationally. His voice made people feel connected to him. But in the white South, that same quality made him dangerous. The absurdity of the policy was most visible in the inconsistency. Stations would ban Mona Lisa but play Route 66. Both were Nat King Cole recordings, both were successful nationally, but one had vocals and one didn't. The only difference that mattered to Southern program directors: the vocals created intimacy, the instrumental didn't. Some stations went even further. They would play white artists covering Nat King Cole songs while banning Nat's original versions. Mona Lisa was covered by multiple white singers in 1950-1951. Some Southern stations played those covers while refusing to play Nat's version, the original, the hit, the version that made the song famous. The song was the same, the arrangement was often similar, but the race of the singer determined whether it was appropriate or too intimate. This wasn't about music quality. It was about controlling which voices could express romantic emotion to mixed-race audiences. Capitol Records noticed the pattern. Their Southern regional representative, James Mitchell, reported back to the label in 1952, Cole's vocal recordings face systematic resistance from white stations below the Mason-Dixon line. They'll play the trio instrumentals. But solo vocals are being rejected as not fitting format or too sophisticated for our audience. Meanwhile, they're playing white artists covering the same material. Capitol's response was pragmatic. They didn't fight the policy. They just made sure to provide Southern stations with instrumental versions of everything Nat recorded. If the South wouldn't play the vocals, at least they'd play the instrumentals and generate some airplay revenue. This business decision tacitly accepted the racist policy. Rather than challenging stations that banned black vocals based on racial anxiety, Capitol accommodated them. Nat knew about the bans. It was impossible not to know. He'd have hit records topping national charts that couldn't get airplay in large portions of the country. He rarely spoke about it publicly. In a 1953 interview, he was asked why his music didn't get much Southern radio play. His response was carefully neutral. Different markets have different preferences. The South has always preferred instrumental jazz. That's fine. The music reaches people in different ways. But privately, he understood exactly what was happening. The South didn't prefer instrumental jazz. They preferred not hearing black men sing love songs to potentially white audiences. The policy had real commercial impact. Radio airplay drove record sales. When Southern stations refused to play Nat's vocal recordings, it suppressed sales in those markets. Mona Lisa sold over 2 million copies nationally, but sales in the Deep South were significantly lower than population would predict. Not because Southern listeners didn't want the record when they could buy it, many did, but because radio wasn't playing it. Fewer people heard it, fewer people knew it existed, fewer people bought it. Capitol estimated that the Southern vocal ban cost Nat hundreds of thousands in lost sales over the course of the 1950s. Not career-ending money, but significant revenue lost purely to racism. The ban also shaped what kind of music Capitol encouraged Nat to record. If vocals didn't play in the South, there was less incentive to invest in elaborate vocal productions. Better to focus on instrumental arrangements or songs that could work both as vocals and instrumentals. This indirectly influenced Nat's artistic development, not through direct censorship, but through commercial pressure shaped by racist regional policies. The justifications station managers gave for the bans were revealing in their transparency. When pressed, they'd fall back on coded language that barely concealed the real reasoning: his voice is too intimate for family listening. Translation: we don't want black male voices creating emotional connection with white female listeners. The material is too sophisticated for our demographic. Translation: love songs are only appropriate when sung by white men. We prefer upbeat, cheerful music. This one was used even when banning Nat's upbeat, cheerful songs while playing sad, slow songs by white artists. It doesn't fit our format. Said by stations that played jazz, pop, and standards, exactly Nat's format. The real reason was never stated officially: controlling black masculine sexuality and preventing any form of intimacy, even parasocial and mediated, between black men and white women. This was Jim Crow extending into the airwaves. Physical segregation was law, social segregation was custom. Radio bans were cultural segregation, controlling which voices could speak, which could sing, which could express emotion, which could create connection. Some black-owned radio stations in the South played Nat's vocals without restriction, but their broadcast range was limited. Their audiences were smaller. They couldn't compensate for the ban at major white-owned stations. And white listeners in the South who wanted to hear Nat's vocals often couldn't, unless they bought the records themselves or traveled to areas with different stations. The policy created a bifurcated musical landscape. National charts showed Nat King Cole as one of the biggest stars in America. Southern radio acted as if his vocals didn't exist. By the mid-1950s, the ban was becoming harder to maintain. Nat's fame was too big, his crossover appeal too strong. Economic pressure was building as advertisers recognized they were missing a popular artist. Some stations began quietly relaxing the restrictions, playing Nat's vocals late at night or on weekends, times when the family audience wasn't listening. This revealed the policy's true nature. If the vocals were genuinely inappropriate, time of day wouldn't matter. But if the real concern was white families hearing them during prime time, then late-night play was acceptable. The Birmingham television incident in 1956, when Nat was attacked on stage by white supremacists during his TV show taping, temporarily hardened positions. Some southern stations that had started playing his vocals stopped again, fearing association with controversy. But by 1957-1958, the complete ban was crumbling. Rock and roll was blurring racial boundaries in ways that made the king. Cole vocal bans seem quaint. If stations were playing Little Richard and Chuck Berry, banning Nat King Cole's comparatively genteel vocals became absurd. The ban quietly ended without ever being officially acknowledged. Stations just started playing the vocals. No announcements, no apologies, just gradual integration into playlists. By 1960, most southern stations played Nat's music without restriction. The thing they'd called too intimate and dangerous in 1951 was standard adult contemporary programming in 1960. What changed? Not the music, not Nat's voice, just the cultural willingness to accept a black man's voice expressing romantic emotion on mainstream radio. The history of this band was largely forgotten. It wasn't dramatic like concert hall segregation. It wasn't violent like the Birmingham attack. It was bureaucratic. Administrative, station managers making quiet decisions that never generated headlines, but it was systematic. It affected Nat's career. It shaped what millions of Southern listeners heard, and it revealed how racism operated through cultural gatekeeping as much as through law or violence. The ban also demonstrated how intimacy itself was racialized. Intimacy was acceptable within racial boundaries. White singers could be intimate with white audiences. Black singers could be intimate with black audiences, but cross-racial intimacy, even the mediated parasocial intimacy of a voice on the radio, was threatening, had to be controlled, had to be prevented. That's what too intimate really meant. Not too emotional or too personal in some absolute sense, too intimate across racial lines, too capable of creating connection between black performer and white listener. The irony is that Nat King Cole's entire commercial strategy was built on crossover appeal. He wanted to reach white audiences. He cultivated a sophisticated, non-threatening public image specifically to be acceptable to white listeners, and he succeeded nationally. White audiences across the North and West loved him, bought his records, attended his concerts. He proved that black artists could achieve mainstream success. But the white South said, "We'll accept your piano playing, we'll accept your instrumental arrangements, but we won't accept your voice singing to our daughters and wives." That boundary holds. It was a revealing compromise. It showed that Southern resistance wasn't about music quality or sophistication. It was specifically about vocal intimacy and the gendered, racialized anxieties that intimacy triggered. Today, this story is largely forgotten. When people discuss Nat King Cole's career, they mention the TV show cancellation, the Birmingham attack, the broader struggle for black artists in a segregated industry. But the radio vocal ban doesn't get mentioned much, maybe because it's harder to dramatize, maybe because stations never admitted it officially, maybe because the evidence is scattered across hundreds of local programming decisions that were never centrally documented. But it happened systematically across the region for years, and it mattered. It affected Nat's sales. It shaped regional musical culture. It demonstrated how racism could operate through quiet administrative decisions as effectively as through loud public confrontation. The ban also showed how racism adapted to cultural change. As jazz became more acceptable, the ban couldn't be about genre. As sophistication became valued, it couldn't be about refinement. So it became about intimacy, about voice, about the specific threat of a black man's voice creating emotional connection with white listeners. That was a boundary Southern stations would enforce even when they'd relaxed others. Nat King Cole's voice was his greatest instrument. Smooth, warm, emotionally direct. It made people feel seen, understood, connected. That's exactly why the white South banned it from the airwaves for years, because connection was threatening, because intimacy crossed lines they wanted to maintain. Because a black voice expressing romantic emotion was, in their calculus, dangerous. The piano was safe, the voice was not. That distinction, arbitrary, racist, absurd, shaped Southern radio for a decade. And Nat King Cole, one of the greatest voices in American music, was silenced in a region that needed to hear him most. Not through violence, not through law, through station manager decisions, playlist restrictions, and the quiet enforcement of cultural boundaries. His voice was called too intimate. What they meant was too human, too capable of making white listeners recognize the humanity of a black artist. Too effective at crossing lines that segregation demanded remain uncrossed. So they banned the voice, but played the piano, and convinced themselves it was about music, not race, about format, not fear, about appropriateness, not control. The lie was transparent then, it remains transparent now. Nat King Cole's voice wasn't too intimate. White Southern radio was too racist to let black intimacy exist in there. Airspace, that's the real story, not about music, about power, and about who gets to speak, sing, and be heard. The mechanisms of enforcement were subtle but effective. Station managers didn't need written policies. When Capitol sent promotional packages with both vocal and instrumental versions, program directors would file the vocals away and play only instrumentals. Researchers later found the pattern. Stations would play 30 to 40 King Cole trio instrumentals, but 0 Nat King Cole solo vocals. When questioned years later, former managers offered vague explanations, different era, different audience, convenient amnesia that avoided admitting the policy's racist foundation. But the impact was real. Young black musicians growing up in the South in the 1950s heard Nat King Cole's piano on the radio, but not his voice. They knew. A major star nationally, but their local stations acted as if half his catalog didn't exist. This sent a message about what was acceptable. Instrumental talent was okay, but black vocal expression of emotion, particularly romantic emotion, was not. Some young artists internalized that boundary, others were motivated to cross it. But all were shaped by growing up in a musical environment where the most successful black vocalist in America was partially silenced by local gatekeepers. The contrast with Northern and Western radio was stark. In New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, Nat's vocals received heavy airplay. He was everywhere. His voice was synonymous with romantic sophistication. But drive south and the radio landscape changed. The trios, Route 66 played fine. Mona Lisa disappeared. This geographic division of musical culture was a direct product of racism, not market preference, not audience taste, administrative racism enforced through programming decisions, and it worked. For years it worked. The South maintained racial boundaries in popular music longer than other regions, and the vocal ban was part of that maintenance. When the ban finally ended in the late 1950s, it wasn't because of pressure campaigns or protests. It was because the economic logic of excluding a major star became untenable, and because broader cultural changes made the specific boundary impossible to defend. But nobody apologized, nobody acknowledged what had happened. The stations that banned Nat's voice in 1951 were playing it in 1960 as if there had never been any problem. Historical continuity without accountability. The American way of dealing with racism that becomes inconvenient.